Hi there, this is Christine Richards, Research Director for Zpryme, and we're excited to be at ABB's Boulder, Colorado offices today to do an ETS interview with Nicholson, who is the head of Global Product Management and Marketing for ABB Enterprise Software. Thanks for joining us today, Rick. Oh,
it's my pleasure. I'm glad we can take some time to do this.
Excellent. Well, we're just going to talk a little bit about ITOT integration. We did a recent study on it, and
I'd love to
ask you some questions.
Okay, let's get started.
Just to start off, I think in that report there was a great quote that you had there, and I'll read that off. The importance of asset management was eclipsed for a few years by the focus on smart grid investments, but now we're seeing it back up on the upswing. So what is that upswing? What are some of the changes that you're seeing to really bring asset management back into focus for utilities?
Okay, so as I mentioned in the quote, I don't think the drivers for asset management in utilities ever went away. Mm-hmm. It's just that there was kind of a refocus or maybe a distraction on smart grid investments and programs. A lot of that was driven by, at least in the US, the fact that stimulus funding was available, so utilities took advantage of that. But what really was the situation in the background that never went away was things that we've been talking about for well over a decade. So for instance, aging infrastructure. It's not like that problem went away. It was still there, it is still there. And just to give you an example, so one of our customers, American Electric Power, did some statistics on their fleet of substation transformers. Mm-hmm. And what they found out was that 33% of their substation transformers were over 50 years old.
Wow.
And in fact, 18% of them were over 60 years old. That's a lot of assets out there. I mean, AEP has over 3,500 transmission substations. Yeah. So it's a big problem. It never went away. Mm-hmm. It's still there, and it's still a driver, and that's common across most utilities, I'd say, in North America. So that's still there. The other one we've talked about for a long time is the other aging problem, the aging workforce problem, and then seeing a wave of retirement of people that have been around a long time in a utility, have a lot of knowledge about those assets, and the need to somehow capture that knowledge and then transfer that to newer workforce that's coming into the utility. So that's part of it. I would say if there's something new, it's that you are starting to see a wave of capital investment in assets finally that's been deferred for a really long time, and now we're starting to see an uptick in that.
So it's really starting to catch up with utilities, and they are having
I think we're seeing the beginning of it.
Okay. Now, when we talk about asset management, something that comes up a lot is that focus on being real time, being predictive within asset management. And I know from talking with you, you're really an advocate of looking at that long term, more capital planning perspective.
Right.
So how do utilities really find that balance? I mean, why is it important to focus on the longer term piece?
Well, I think that the key term is balance. Mm-hmm. That's a good way of characterizing it, because on the one hand, you do want to improve the ability to predict when an asset is likely to fail.
Yeah.
Because with a fleet of assets like I just described, the risk of failure is quite high. In some cases. So you want to be able to do that, but at the same time, if all you're doing is kind of capturing short-term kind of potential failures, you're never kind of getting ahead of the curve, right?
Yeah.
You have to balance that with looking at how am I going to best allocate my capital investment in replacements, refurbishments, those types of things over a much longer time frame, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, even up to 20 years. Then if you're able to balance those two, you can kind of optimize how you're managing the assets. But it does really have to be that balance.
Yeah. So how do utilities start to get to that point? Within their organizations, what sort of work should they be working on, to find that right balance?
Well, I think part of it gets back to the reason we did this study in the first place, which was looking at the classic kind of information technology, operational technology. How do you bring those together? A lot of it starts with data. Right, so I mean, utilities are often surprised that they have as much data as they already do. They tend to think, oh, we have to kind of go off and get all this new data.
Yeah.
Well, in many cases, they've got adequate data, but it's it hasn't been organized properly. It's in silos. It hasn't been utilized correctly. So bringing kind of data from both the IT side, which tends to have kind of the asset management systems in place, with the OT side, which has more of the real-time systems, the SCADA systems, the online monitoring, bringing those together. But it's not just about kind of the data and the technology. It's also getting teams to work together more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we talked about in the report, is that, IT-OT integration isn't just about the technology.
Right.
It's about the integration of the people and really getting them to work together on asset management. So do you have any examples you've seen of where that's been successful?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of useful examples of IT-OT integration, not purely from a technology perspective, from a people perspective. I would call out CenterPoint Energy as an example.
Okay.
Now, this happens to be an initiative that was more of a smart grid initiative, but it's a great example because CenterPoint was awarded some of that stimulus funding from the government that I mentioned before, and put that into a series of projects that were in most cases aimed at reducing the number of outages that their customers experience.
Yeah.
And they were only able to really do that and get the results that they did. I think that most recently they said that they were able to avoid over 100 million minutes of outages.
Wow.
As a result of these initiatives.
Yeah.
But the only way they could do that effectively was to have an integrated team of people from both the IT side of their business as well as the operational side of the business, working together to not only focus on kind of bringing the technology together, but the processes, the business processes, had to work in a kind of a unified fashion as well. So I think that's one good example right there.
Yeah. I mean, that business process piece, I mean, that's definitely critical. Now, one more question I had for you, a hot topic that always continues to come up is just, the Internet of Things and IoT. So,
right.
My question for you is around the IoT and IT-OT integration,
right.
for asset management. I mean, what role does the Internet of Things play, and how is it going to change for utilities? Well,
I mean, I know that, a lot of people would think that it's kind of an overhyped term. But there is actually, I think, in my opinion, a real potential benefit. And that is that, and it gets back to when I was mentioning before the data. If all you have is kind of historical maintenance and inspection records for assets, and you might have some data off of a SCADA historian, I mean, you can do a lot with that. But if you start to get kind of data that really fits kind of what people think about as Internet of Things, like more sensors, more frequent data, more high fidelity data about the assets, you can just do much more with that. So it's not a situation where you have nothing or you have something. It's a scale, right? And as you add more and more intelligent devices, more sensors around those assets, you're able to just do a better job because it's feeding into these asset performance models. It's feeding into machine learning techniques that you might be using to, once again, kind of get a better view of not only the current condition of the assets, but kind of what may happen in the future in either a predictive or even a prescriptive fashion around those assets. So it is, it's going to add more and more value as you start to kind of roll out more and more of these kind of IoT initiatives.
Yeah, so I mean, it sounds like it's really, an evolution that's taking place, and just, more and more information, data, sensors that are going to be added to asset management.
That's absolutely true. And we see utilities starting to kind of almost take a step back and do kind of data readiness assessments before jumping into an IoT initiative. So they kind of better understand what their starting point is, and then, as you said, they can start to evolve in a fashion that gives them better value.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Rick. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Glad you could make it, and I've always enjoyed these types of chats.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.